Brick buildings that line River Street were constructed in the 19th century as cotton warehouses. In the mid-1800s, Savannah was one of the world's leading cotton exporters. We docked right next to the Hyatt Regency with this impressive World War II memorial in front of us.
Down Bay Street, from that green and white small awning off to the left, all the way down to the building that says Moon River Brewing Company. That is all pre-Civil War. All of this is antebellum and would have been here when Sherman was here. There are two cannon in there that George Washington sent the city of Savannah. Bay Street, Bay Lane. This is where about half of the actual slave trade of Savannah took place. Don't tread on us. So 6 weeks before South Carolina secedes, you have Savannah giving the first metaphorical middle finger to Abraham Lincoln. Now we fast forward to January, just 2 months after this rally. It's January 3rd of 1861. Georgia has not seceded, which means Georgia is one of the United States. And our U.S. Senator Robert Toombs is up in Washington, D.C., and he wires down here to Georgia's governor, a guy named Joe Brown. He says, "Governor Brown, there is talk in Washington of Union forces reinforcing Fort Pulaski, which is the massive fort at the mouth of the Savannah River, and they're going to try to take Fort Pulaski. They have no idea who's there. They don't know if there's 300 Union soldiers or 0. So when they get there, they land their boat, they go and bang on the big wooden door, and it opens up with 2 men, an ordnance sergeant and a caretaker. To this point, this is no different than Fort Sumter, except Confederates fired on Fort Sumter. But this is still a taking by a state of federal property. That same one for Mary Marshall, one of our largest landholders prior to. She also owned some warehouses on the western end of Broughton Street. Should say gave 2 of those to the Confederate government, and they turned them into hospitals, one for enlisted Confederates and one for officers. But she had 62 rooms in here. She had 2 restaurants. She had a men's cigar lounge. She also had a ladies' parlor, a place where women could go and hang out after dinner. She ran Savannah's first rooftop bar because of that. But again, it's rare that any hotel in the South or even the country that was built as a hotel before the Civil War still is, let alone still looks very similar to how it did in the 1860s. Because Oglethorpe's monument's a few squares down in Chippewa Square. But here I want to talk about squares, but I also want to get us through the first year of the war. So Savannah had 24 squares at the time of the Civil War. We have 22 today. 3 were destroyed when Highway 17 was extended through the western side of Savannah. One of those was brought back. So we're 22 of the original 24. When Sherman's men were here, they left citizens alone for the most part. And the unit raised in Georgia must stay in Georgia. But the problem is, Francis Bartow wants to take his unit to Virginia. He knows that's where the war is going to break out. So he is able to get the Confederate Congress to pass a bill that says that any unit that is raised with private funds, i.e. no state, no public funds, they may offer their services to the Confederate president, and he can send them where he sees fit. So he gets the bill passed, and he wires back to Savannah, and he tells the Oglethorpe Light Infantry what happened. So he's sent to Harper's Ferry. He will be, he's actually given command of 5,000 men. He becomes a brigadier general, so not just his couple hundred from Savannah. From Harper's Ferry, 2,000 of his men, the 7th and 8th Georgia regiments, are sent to Manassas Junction. His men will be the first men ever in the history of the world to be transported by train to battle. If you've
Lafayette stayed here when he visited back in the U.S. a long time after the Revolutionary War.
That was the post-war home of Joe Johnston, Confederate general. Like I said, y'all feel free to come in here. I want to leave a little bit of room on the sidewalk for folks to walk so they can get here.
Predates the Revolutionary War.
Johnston is a legend, just like Grant, just like Sherman. Memoirs are very hot. He thinks that he's going to be able to sell these like gangbusters. But remember Johnston's Civil War history. Remember, he's in charge of the entire army in Virginia until he's wounded at 7 Pines. And then Davis sends him to Mississippi, where he loses Vicksburg. Davis sends him to Chattanooga, where he ends up losing Atlanta. And then at the end of the war, Davis gives him an order that says, hey, we're going to perform guerrilla warfare in North Carolina. That means your army must be intact. Do not surrender your army. 3 weeks later, guess what he does? He surrenders Sherman. He will surrender more men than Lee does at Appomattox. But like I said, he's here. He wrote his memoirs. A very important man named James Moore Wayne. Wayne becomes a Savannah mayor, but then he goes on to the U.S. Supreme Court, where he will vote against Dred Scott in the Dred Scott decision for the time. So he becomes persona non grata here in Savannah. He does not return to Savannah until a couple years after the war, when he's in a casket and taken to Laurel Grove Cemetery. So he sells the home in 1831. It's bought by William Gordon. Gordon's the man who started the Central Georgia Railroad. But William Gordon Jr. is living there with his wife Eleanor when the Civil War breaks out. So he joins Confederate cavalry. So when Sherman's men are in Savannah, Gordon Jr. is gone, but his wife is still there. Eleanor is from Chicago. So before the Civil War, her wealthy family knew many of these wealthy families of the Midwest, many of whom sent sons to West Point. Visits at least 3 times, and in one of those visits, he tells his third in command, Oliver Howard, Howard, I know you're missing your daughters up in Maine. Come into the Gordon home, play with the young daughters, you'll feel like you're at home. So he does, 7 times. So he sits down in a chair, and 5-year-old Juliet Yankees. Fortunately, they're able to laugh this off, but that little girl later becomes Juliet Gordon.
It's an independent Presbyterian church.
Savannah's worst year. Remember, at the mouth of the Savannah River is Fort Pulaski. I'll show you, I'll pass around a map. I know it's kind of dark here. You see Savannah, you see Fort Pulaski. 18 miles away. Fort Pulaski, 18 years to build it, 7.5 feet thick walls. So this is a massive fort. So on those islands, on the back of Tybee Island, Union troops begin building gun emplacements in January of 1862. It'll take them 3 months to complete these. The reason being, it's in swamp. So they have to build platforms, they have to put pilings into the swampy ground. Robert E. Lee respects Fort Pulaski in January of 1862, and he told Charles Olmsted, the now 24-year-old commander, he said, they can make it hot for you with shells, but they cannot breach your walls at that distance. East, the Confederates realized there is a hairline crack. They can see sun rays coming through what was a day before, 7 feet of brick. So by the morning of the next day, after only 29 hours of total bombardment, Fort Pulaski will look like, I'll show you. There, Fort Pulaski looks like this. You all are well aware by now, Sherman divides his army into 2 wings. You've got the left wing and the right wing. We'll tell a story from each of the wings. And I want to show you Ebenezer Creek, which is 30 miles inland from Savannah. See my finger pointing at it here. Ebenezer Creek, he lays a bridge across, his soldiers cross, and he cuts that before the refugee slaves can get to it. Someone allegedly yells, rebels, because Joe Wheeler's Confederate cavalry was in the area. People panic. We know that hundreds of people went into Ebenezer Creek to try to swim across. We know that very few came out on the other side of the story. The night of December 20th, William Hardee lays a bridge across the river, covers it in straw, and wraps his cannon wheels in cloth. And he gets all 10,000 men out from under Sherman's nose. So the war ends 5 months later. Those 10,000 Confederates will fight Sherman twice more in North Carolina at Averysboro and Bentonville, and cause over 3,000 more Union casualties. To the Second Continental Congress, when he got there, he changed his mind, and he came back and he wrote, a Republican government is little better than a government of devils. The church moves here in 1819, and 2 very important people walk through those front doors in May of 1819. John C. Calhoun, who's Secretary of War, later becomes Vice President, but more importantly, James Monroe, the President, walks through those doors, and class here at IPC were also killed at Manassas, and their bodies were returned together, and they had a joint funeral, casket by casket by casket. The city could fit in here. So you can imagine how packed that funeral was in February of '62 when those bodies were finally returned. Out in the northwestern corner of Savannah, and it's put out fairly quickly, but an ember floats across town and hits the wooden steeple of this church, and it burns this church literally from the top down. And they decide to do it to the exact same specifications. So in 1891, the church is reopened. It looks the same as it did when Monroe and Calhoun were here.
When the church burned down, that burned. But this one won't.